Greetings, everyone. I have to screen share, so I'm going to be doing that. And then when that happens, it's going to throw me off, so you won't see me. But you'll hear my voice. I am Cecile Johnson. I am the CEO and founder of African Development Plan. I'm a human rights defender and a co-founder of the Pendo Center for Human Rights and Self-Determination. And I'm a co-facilitator of the African Descendant Nation USA. Myself, Sister Elena, who's going to be speaking here today, are original signatories. So this work that we're doing is it's years in the making. I just love all the presenters who have presented before, and I want you to see that even though we do this work and it's 24/7, that the joy that's in our heart. And that's what I've seen so far from everyone who's talked. So hopefully I'll be able to not depress you, because we'll leave you with some positives. But I tried to cut this presentation down the best I could. You're just gonna have to bear with me. And let's share the screen. Okay. Oops. Okay, so today's topic is going to be self-determination for the African descendant in the USA, and I'm using Chicago as a case study. We're going to be going from an African-centered perspective. Sister Ya talked about that. I want you all to know an African-centered perspective for me is everything that I see, I just want to know how is it going to impact my community. And I really need people to begin to think like that. Many times we're educated by others and we end up going on to represent their interests because we have a Eurocentric perspective, even in the work we do for our community. So this presentation is from an African-centered perspective. Like Dr. Frazier, I'm not apologizing for how I feel about my community. And we're also going to be using a human rights framework. So you're going to gain a full understanding of what's happening in the African descendants and why self-determination is needed, and how to see the world from an African-centered perspective. We're going to understand the importance of data in telling our story and our right to development, the Human Development Index, what that means, what is self-determination, and how does it impact our identity, our sovereignty and reparations, and then what are some next steps in community empowerment. So let's look at Chicago. Chicago is more than just in the Midwest. Chicago is in the heartland. I call Chicago the heart of what's going on here with Black people in America, because what happens to us here, I feel like they're running an experiment. They're able to do it, get away with it, they're gonna do it everywhere else. So in Chicago, we have a tale of two cities. It's the Great Chicago, right? So we had a great migration that our people left the South because of lynching and other horrific conditions, came here. And now we have a great Black exodus where people are deciding that this city that they came to for hope 60, 70, 80, 90, 100 years ago is not the right place for them. So many neighborhoods on Chicago's west and south side have seen disinvestment for decades. So in 2000, we were 40% of the population. Today, we're 29%. And that represents over 250,000 people have left, Black people have left. So who is it that's leaving? Largely families with children, ages 35 to 54, and children under 19. And when you look at our middle income majority Black communities, Chicago is located in Cook County. And in 2010, there was 47 of them, right? And in 2017, that had dropped to 27. So the people who were leaving also had some wealth. And in Chicago, 23 of those, and then it dropped to 17. So we've seen a big decline. Now, in 2017, there was a study called the Racial Wealth Divide, and it said the story in Chicago is one of access, or rather a lack thereof, often recognized as one of the most segregated cities in the South, in the United States. Today, Chicago is the product of decades of policies that have had effect of isolating communities of color. And this is important for us to remember, Because sometimes when we talk about issues of racism, et cetera, we act like we don't know who's doing it. It's policies that have been put into place. So during the 20th century, government officials implemented policies that worked against our communities. City leaders used their legislative redistricting power to redraw school district lines and the city's housing market, keeping African-American families separate in what came to be known as the Black Belt. That's the city's Chicago South Side and also the West Side. And through the use of such tools as exclusionary zoning laws, racially restrictive covenants, and racial steering, political establishment of the time laid the foundation for today's racial boundaries. So these things begin to impact not only real estate, but our healthcare access, our financial services, and especially education when you see the poor outcomes of Black students in our educational system, not only in Chicago, but in the state of Illinois and across the nation. So in Chicago, these boundaries have led to educational outcomes that are worse than the rest of the nation, right? So what's unique about this is that even though all across the country, you just have to drop us in any community, you see the same thing, the rigidity of our racial boundaries is what sets the city apart. And without intentional effort to ensure equitable access to such services as education, housing, healthcare, and banking, the city is at risk of continuing along the path of racial inequality and segregation. This is very critical for you to remember. So as we begin to look at things, remember, the story of Chicago is one of access. Okay. So the city has, in many places, tax increment financing, and this was designed to help poor people, right? In poor and distressed communities by creating more capital investment. Instead, what you saw is tens of millions of dollars being diverted to support projects located in downtown and in other affluent parts of the city. So when we have, as the National Black Agenda, we had participated in many other projects. And one of them was very revealing, right? When we looked at where the TIF funds were being spent, we saw that it was spent in the near loop, the near north side, the near south side, the near west side. And when we looked at the neighborhoods that met the criteria for TIF, like Pullman, Riverdale, Roseland, West Pullman, you can see 4.8 million spent, pennies compared to what they gave downtown. So when you come to Chicago, you see that you go downtown, it's like, wow, that's the two cities we're talking about. You come to Roseland, Pullman, West Pullman, Inglewood, South Side, West Side, you see the other Chicago. That's where we happen to be. So there's something called the Human Development Index. It's a UN right to development, and its index is based on three different things: health, education, and earnings. And this is the things that shape the opportunities available to people and enable people to invest in their families and live to their full potential. It does this through looking through the lens from geography. That's where you're located, your gender, male or female, and your race and ethnicity. And in most of my data, everything I do is broken into race and ethnicity. Because if you look at the overall score, many times you don't get the right impression. The overall score for the United States might be a 5 or a 6, but when you begin to look at us individually, you see that we have a very low Human Development Index. And so in the picture that you see next to the Native American, which we also are part of, you can see that we are at the bottom of the Human Development Index in the United States. And the chart to the right, the purple is Latino and the blue is African American. And even in the city where we had been 40% and we're now 29%, we're the lowest Human Development Index in Chicago. Now let's look at life expectancy. Oops. What I found very startling in Chicago, when I looked in 2012 and saw that we had a 14-year gap, I was already like, wow, what's going on? But then in 2019, that gap had increased to 30 years in some of our communities. And yet you get a message that everything is okay. In 7 years, we doubled a decrease in our life expectancy. If that's not a red flag, I mean, we should be out in the streets protesting, right? But people need to really understand what the data means. So when you look at the leading cause of death for Blacks, you see heart disease, cancer, unintentional injuries, stroke, homicide, diabetes, chronic lower respiratory diseases, kidney, HIV, and septicemia. I put the ones in red because we're the only community that has in the top 10 homicide, HIV disease, and septicemia. And septicemia is a serious bloodstream infection. Okay? Now, when you look at HIV, Blacks are the majority of new HIV cases, 42% of the cases, but we only represent in the United States, 13% of the population. 62% of the women who have HIV are Black women, but we hardly hear anything about that. And 64% of the children under the age of 13. And then when you look at our communities, we have, it's easier for us to access fast food than it is for us to get fresh food. And so we have an imbalance in our health food options, and this increases our premature death and chronic health conditions. When you look at obesity rates for adults, Blacks have the highest obesity rate. And when you look at African-American men and women, 82% of our women are obese and 69% of our men are obese. Those numbers are the same high numbers within the children also. So this diabetes is disproportionately impacting the Black community in Illinois. I've been to many different parts of the country. It's the same pattern. So food deserts, economic instability, healthcare access, and education all play a role in this poor health outcomes. And nationally, we have Black infant mortality rate is 2 times that of white. White is usually 5 per 1,000. Black is usually like 10, 11. And maternal mortality rate is 3 times that of white. But when you get to Chicago, what do you see? Black women are in a crisis here. Their rate is 6 times higher, right? And Black infants are dying at 3 times the rate. I told you whites, it's 5 per 1,000. And it's almost like everywhere in the country I've been, that's about where they stay. In Chicago, it's 14 per 1,000. So again, this is an international indicator. This was part of the Millennium Development Goals, looking at mortality rates for women, mothers, and we should be ashamed that this is so high and we are not addressing it adequately. Now, I told you homicide was we were the only group that had it in the top 10. And as you can see, 80.7% of the people shot in Chicago are Black and 81% of those are male. This is going to have serious impact later on when we begin to talk about marriage rates, right? And how this homicide is impacting our ability to find the right mate. And then to add to all of this, when you go to the doctor, there's a stereotype about how you can handle pain, and which makes our hospitalization and care even more painful. Now, part of this problem is also because we have only 5.7% of the physicians and surgeons. And so when we talk about solutions, we need an investment in our young people who want to become doctors and nurses. This will change some of the outcomes for us. Recently, the National Black Agenda did a forum on human trafficking, and I didn't usually include human trafficking in my report. And then I started to look at it. And not only was it horrific, 40% of the victims of human trafficking are Black, 62% of the human trafficking suspects are Black, and 52% of all juvenile prostitution arrests, right? They shouldn't be charged with juvenile prostitution. They're part of a sex trade, right? Someone's trafficking them. And then we found that the penalties associated with trafficking African Americans are less severe. So therefore, people feel it's okay to do this. Now, Chicago is currently top 5 in the top 5 cities in sex trafficking crimes. And when you look at something that came out 2 years ago, self-reported attempts of Black adolescents for suicide, you see a direct correlation. All of these conditions that are happening in our community are causing severe depression amongst our young people. And there was a 73% increase in self-reported suicide attempts. This is not a good thing. Now, when we look at education, I'm going to focus specifically on Chicago, but this is everywhere across the nation. Our 4th graders and our 8th graders are performing at, say, 17 and 18% in their math and in their reading scores. So in Chicago, usually you get good news. You know, the good news is, hey, everybody, scores for youth are going up as it relates to education. Then the next day they'll put an article. So he's got to watch for the next day, right? Because it's 2 cities. And you see that the scores for low-income Black students were stagnating and actually declining for the rest of Illinois. So here was this message about how everything was fine and dandy. But again, when you break us out, like I said, only want to know what's going on with us. It wasn't good. So 2018 showed that nearly all of the under and low performing schools in Chicago were on the south side. That's where we live, folks, right? Or sitting on board of the city's poorest census tracts, and they're staring down steep enrollment declines and teach a higher than average percentage of students with disabilities. That's a lot of it is also students who are getting Title I, right? Which means that the schools are getting extra money, and that extra money should help to increase the children's scores because they're supposed to get the wraparound services, et cetera. They're not getting them. So money's coming in, but the money is not actually increasing the academic performance of the children. So 17.4% of the Black students are reading proficient. And in 2019, less than a third of Chicago students scored proficient or better. And the new scores also added in mounting evidence that Chicago's gap in performance across students of different races are not closing, right? You can see that whites are increasing, have improved faster, and so therefore our achievement gap is getting bigger, it's widening. So across America, we found that 75% of Black high school students were graduating. Now, the question is, when you look at their 12th grade scores, right, those who are prepared for college level curriculum, look at what we're finding here. Reading, 16% already, 14% in math, 10% in science. And I don't know, they're not reading too well, but they seem to be writing some because the English score is up to 34%. I question that. But in all four areas, Black high school graduates have lower readiness rates than everyone. When I see the Latino schools in Chicago, they get a lot of wraparound services and resources. And we're not here to deny them that. We're saying that our schools need to get the same wraparound services and resources. Because education is a key, is a right to education is a key benefit to society, right? It's fundamental for human, social, and economic development, and a key element to achieving lasting peace and sustainable development. It's an empowering right. It lifts people out of poverty, and it's an indispensable means of realizing other rights. It contributes to the full development of the human personality. So when we fail to take an assessment of the education that's going on and the poor performance, and we continue to accept this, it's unacceptable. Now, this poor state of education shows us the wrong priorities, because look at how much the state of Illinois spends $94 million for 546 youth to be incarcerated. And as you can see, we are 17% of the population and 69% of those incarcerated, right? And we're 15% of the population when it comes to adults, and we're 56% of the incarcerated. I mean, the numbers are so staggering that it has stood out internationally that Illinois has a serious problem. So we're spending $172,000 to incarcerate these children, when $6,000 per child or a little bit more could be used to do things for them in the community that actually rehabilitate them and what we call do some tuck pointing, get them ready for life instead of training them to be criminals. 1 in 9 Black child has an incarcerated parent, and so the children are inadvertently victims of their parents' crimes, right? Now they get thrown into foster care. They don't have their parents. Sometimes their parents are gone for all of their young life, and they bounce around from foster care homes. So they suffer a host of repercussions from the emotional and psychological trauma, and they're also at risk for juvenile delinquency. So we're 15% of the population and 50% of the children in foster care. And we have found a correlation between foster care and children who end up in the sex trade, as well as missing child victims, right? So this is critical. We're 15% of the population and 50% of the children in foster care. The community has to step up. So you remember I told you all those people, all these men, either dead from homicide or dead from, or lost to us years at a time in the prison system. So that leads to 15% more Black women due to higher mortality rates of Black men. This is important because at birth, our numbers are equal. It's through attrition, through the homicide, through the incarceration, that we then end up becoming 15% more. So 34% of Black women are married, 67% of white women are married, and that's because of high unemployment and high incarceration. When you look at poverty, right, we're going to move to Human Development Index option number income. We look at poverty. And nationally, we have a 22% poverty rate. Illinois, 26.2% poverty rate versus 9.6% for whites. And that's kind of standard around the country. Theirs is always under 10. And we are always in the 20s. And in some places, within Chicago, we have areas where our poverty rates are 48, 58%, okay? So poverty has two realities. As again, watch the media. Chicago household income grows, poverty drops for 5th straight year. So who is the media representing? Obviously not our reality, because 1 in 5 Chicagoans live below the poverty line, and 1 in 3 Black people, and this was before COVID, are living in under the poverty line. Historically, 2.5 Blacks have been 2.5 times the unemployment rate of whites. This is for decades now, and Black youth unemployment is up to over 60%. We've had times here where it was like 80 something, 90%. So while we were 32% of the population in 2017, we were only getting 7.8% silver of the city's 1.05 billion contracting pie. This is important because we have high unemployment, we had high numbers in the city, yet when it comes to where the money goes, which it goes to other communities and keeps them in the middle class status, we've seen that we've gotten very little of that money, yet we contribute a lot to it, to the budget. In 2016, there was a report that said the average Black family would need 228 years to build the wealth of a white family, right? And if the racial wealth divide is left unaddressed, median Black household wealth is on the path to hit 0 by 2053. That number, 228 years, that's if they stop moving, waiting on us. And you know they're not stopped moving. So this is, again, these ramifications of racism, right? Because past public policies created these racial wealth divide, and current policies widen it. In 2019, the median wealth of a single white man is 14.6 times a single Black man, and 224.2 times greater than the single Black woman. Many of them had less than $100, people, right? This is not looking good. This is 2019. And then in the second quarter of 2020, white people got $94 trillion, and we got 4% of the wealth, $4.6 trillion. All right, so 60% of the population got 84% of the wealth, and 13.4% of the population got 4% of the wealth. Now, it's like with us, it's just compounding. Loss of land has contributed to the zero net worth. We know that most of our wealth, for those who have some, starts with our home. But many Blacks over the last couple of decades have lost their land. And so we compose less than 2% of the nation's farmers and 1% of its rural landowners. Our Black farmers used to be 14% of the farms in 1920. We're now 2% in 2017. This has serious ramifications, not only for wealth as far as land, but also for food and the quality of the food that we get. And when you look at millionaires, Black families have only 1.9% of the millionaires, while white families have 15.2%, right? So there was a Kerner Commission in the 1960s, and the findings then are similar to the findings now. We've made progress maybe a decade after the Kerner report, but then the progress stopped and in many ways reversed. So today, racial and ethnic discrimination is again worsening. We're resegregating our cities, our schools, condemning millions of kids to inferior education, taking away their real possibility of getting out of poverty. So this is interesting because a lot of our schools are 90, 100%, some of them Black, or they're Black and Latino in Chicago in the West and South Side. And when you look at it, the children are getting an inferior education. Especially, I substituted and went to a lot of these schools. I'm telling you, what's happening with our children is substandard, right? It's substandard, especially when I see the resources given to others. And these are children who are born here in the United States and not getting the same thing. Excuse me. So let's look at some examples of lack of access and lack of investment. Let's talk about incarceration. Because we live in Illinois, we don't necessarily know that in 9 states across the union, if you were an ex-felon, you can never vote again, right? So here we have one political system when it comes to the national government, but each state has writes its own laws. And we see that some of these states Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, Nebraska, Wyoming, Nevada, and Arizona, they have decided that once you've been a felon, you can't vote again. And when you look at many of these cases, 95% of federal cases are plea bargain. And if they dare to push against it, many times they double or triple their sentences. So it's almost like a no-win situation. But this is how they steal your rights. When you look at Chicago, patient to doctor ratios in 12 neighborhoods equal what they call third world. I prefer the word developing. That means that we have one doctor for every 3,000 people. Again, this has contributed to the state of affairs. And so in 2018, the Washington Post reported no progress for African Americans on home ownership, unemployment, and incarceration in 50 years, right? So much so for the civil rights movement coming out of the 60s and all the kumbaya we keep singing, we have not progressed. Unemployment, home ownership, there's been no growth. 40% then, 40% now. And when it comes to incarceration, is 6.4 times more Blacks have been incarcerated than whites. We are not more criminals, people, no matter what they try to show us with the data. And that's why when we talk about African-centered looking at things, you have to be able to decipher the data and not get caught up, because there are times when the data could be misleading, right, in the way that you interpret it. So the Black Youth Project had done a study, and it said how long the dollar stayed in each community. It said 6 hours in our community, 1 month in the Asian community, 20 days in the Jewish community, and 17 days in the overall white community. And that's critical, because just look around the Black community and ask, how many Black businesses are in the Asian and Arab community, in the white community, in the Latino community, right? And how many of those people are in our community? So these people are practicing self-determination, and we should be practicing that too. The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein is a serious book, because a lot of times we used to think that it was just de facto segregation or private practices, that people just, were discriminating against you. That was an individual landlord or bank person or whatever. And he proved with his book, and he's part of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, that it is in fact de jure segregation, which is government sponsored, right? Which is legal or public policy that creates discriminatory outcomes. So let's look at 2 examples. The federal government pursued 2 important policies in the mid-20th century that segregated metropolitan areas. This is Chicago, one of the first civilian public housing program which frequently demolished integrated neighborhoods in order to create segregated public housing. And the second program was subsidizing development of suburbs on the condition that they only rent to whites, only sell to whites, and the deeds had to have a clause that prohibited resale to African Americans. So these 2 work together to segregate metropolitan areas. And so what you're seeing right now is the result of this, right? So this is the red lining, but it was government policy. The book, The Color of Law, explains how white wealth was built. So quickly, I bought a house in the, say, 50s for $8,000. That's equivalent to $100,000 today. And today I'm selling that house for $300,000 to $400,000, right? I've more than tripled and quadrupled my money. And I have equity of $200,000 to $300,000. What most people do, and if you look at the tax laws, it's very favorable to do this, is they then take the equity out, send their children to better schools, pay for their college, start a business, do all the things that facilitate them moving into middle-class status. If we don't have that same access, you can see now why the median net worth was 22 times below the white wealth net worth in 2010. And then WBEZ did a report last year about home loans in Chicago, and it showed where the banks, and ProPublica, and it showed where the banks, for every $1 to the white neighborhood, all we got was JP Morgan lent 41 times more money in the white neighborhoods. So you look at Lincoln Park, Lakeview, near North Side and West Town, right? And then the entire Black community across the South and West Side, 41 times more money, right? So these current lending practices are no different from the past redlining because they're investing in themselves. They're building their communities. That's self-determination. So home ownership in 1968 was 40%. Today, it's the same. And then when you look at our communities, again, they devalue the property. Many of our homes on the South Side are bigger than some of their homes. But when you look at the valuation, it's rated less. So that means you have less equity. You put your money in and it's really just to live there because others appreciate and yours is not. And this saw that in 2008, again, they disproportionately, we had a lot of foreclosures. And for every dollar that a white person household has in Illinois, a Black household only has 52 cents. So we're working with a 48% deficit, folks, right? And we are 14% of the population and 59% of the homeless. Do we wonder why? And when we look at some of the properties and housing divisions that are put up in the city of Chicago, they pay some money to somebody and they opt out of providing affordable housing. So when we're looking at this and our Black agenda, these are issues that we have to address. Urban renewal is really Black removal, and depopulation leads to less votes, and they're using the property tax and tax liens to gentrify us out of our homes. So you can see from this chart, right, 1990, all that beautiful pink era, that was us. 2010, you see, it's dropped. And if we were to do it now, we lost 250,000 people between 2000 and 2015 until now. So that's going to get a whole lot lighter, right? At the same time, we see an increase in the Hispanic and Asian populations. And when you look in Chicago, you see that they are expanding into our communities and even into other traditional white communities. So in 2017, we got 7.8% of the city's contracts, 1.5 billion contracting pie. And in 2016, it was 11%. So it had dropped while we were 32.3% of the population. And anybody ever wonder why the Hispanics and the Blacks make up almost 60%, 68.2% of the population, but somehow we're called the minorities in these things and get minority contracts. But this also addresses a bigger issue that our young people, our people need to be getting entrepreneurship training, and there needs to be a Black Procurement Technical Assistance Center to be assisting Black business better and bigger than SBA, because they have a women's PTAC, they have a Hispanic PTAC. So obviously there's specialized services that those two groups need. I want to know why the same thing has not happened for us as Black people. Oops. Now, all of these things lead to now, we're in the year of COVID. We've had one whole year of COVID, and it's been horrible for us here in Chicago. The first 100 people that died, 72 of them were Black. And we still see the same disparity across the nation, right? Because the virus erupts, and who gets hit first? The poor people who had poor health. And we're still seeing that. And then people who live in nice houses where they have 3,500 square feet versus 1,500 or less can talk about social distancing, right? And in a blue collar home, people don't have that luxury, apart from the fact that many times you're taking public transportation. And then when you come home, there's more than, people are doubling up. So there's more than enough or less space for people to do social distance. And so it's a privilege. So this is why some of this has impacted us. And then at the time we had some protests and mayhem. It's kind of interesting that we have a screen here talking about George Floyd, and his trial is happening right now, right? And we've had our own trials here in Chicago, police killings and problems, and Laquan McDonald and others, Holman Square. And so we saw the uprising in our communities, and that threw us back a little more economically also, right? The newest report showed that the unemployment and the underemployment for 2019, look at the data for Blacks. Blacks is the top line, right? When COVID hit, we were disproportionately in the hardest hit industries, which were retail sales, transportation, warehousing, and leisure and hospitality. And so the numbers that I gave you before are going to be so skewed in the future because COVID hit us big time in so many ways. And so that's why we're seeing some mayhem and death in our streets, right? Carjacking are higher than in 2020, and murder in the first 3 months of this year rose 33% over the last period, the last year, while shooting spiked 43%. People are frustrated. Then there are other things that have happened with the passing of legalizing marijuana and other things that have created disproportionate impact on communities where sometimes some of the income was coming from that, right? So there's a lot of things. That's why I say when you look at our lives from a Black perspective, it gets real deep. So from a human rights perspective, the 5 elements of the crime of genocide: genocide by killing, by causing serious bodily harm, by deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about physical destruction, by imposing measures intended to prevent birth, by forcibly transferring children. You can see that we are experiencing all 5 elements of the crime of genocide: the unarmed Black people being killed by the police, disproportionate mass incarceration, the colonizers' police occupation of our communities. You see all these blue lights everywhere, but somehow mysteriously we never find any people committing all these crimes, right? But all that money put into police infrastructure, disproportionate exposing Black communities to environmental toxins, the difference in Chicago where you have the 14 per thousand of the babies and children dying, has a lot to do with lead poisoning. And then the lead poisoning also impacts their educational outcomes. Substandard access to food and healthcare, leading to the worst health in the country, high infant mortality and maternal mortality, experimenting on and medicating our children. We've had cases, I think it came out of New York, where they were using experimental drugs for HIV and AIDS on the children, racial disparity in healthcare, social conditions leading to high suicide attempts by our children, and high placement of our children in foster care. We are experiencing all 5 of the elements of the crime of genocide. And so we see what a sister calls decades of the data is to say to you that we're under genocide. She calls it an African Holocaust. We weren't burnt in any in fires. We are the Ma'afa. That's what we call it, right? We are Ma'afa is 500 plus years of great suffering, because you'll see in the next slide what that means. So we have a lack of knowledge about our history, our culture, our worldview, our religion, our self. We have poor self-image. That's why we spend so much money on, the hair and the nails and the preening, right? And clothes, right? Placing high value on light skin and flat, straight hair, and alienation from self and community. Evaluate self and community based on European standards, and over-identification with their oppressors. I tell you, many of us have been Eurocentrically educated, and when we are talking, we don't even realize that we're not even talking about us. We're talking about their interpretation of us, because we are them, right? And so we imitate and model their behavior. And then we have a lot of unrewarding interpersonal relationships in our community. There is a tremendous need for that kind of healing to happen, counseling and conflict resolution, and practices of self-destructive behaviors by taking out frustration and anger about racism on self and those who represent the community. And then the problems of leadership. Most of our leaders, right, they don't represent us. We went and we testified before the Health and Human Services Committee here in Chicago, and all of the members were in agreement that we should have a reparations commission. And 1 week later, the mayor got that man, Mr. Sawyer, to change them and have them come back in and vote, and instead vote for a reparations committee. That was a great betrayal to our community, because we proved, and all of them, no matter what their race, were like, yes, we're tired of the Black, anti-Black that we see in the city. So how foolish this man must have looked when he went back in and got them to change from a reparations commission funded for $1 million to a reparations committee with no funding. And how serious does he think we take that? So how do we solve our crisis? All crisis creates change. Change that occurs from the ideas that are lying around. Our goal is to create those ideas so when the politically impossible becomes politically inevitable, they can be implemented. This is shock doctrine, folks. And this is my doctrine too, because that's why you see all of those people who came on before who talked about the agendas, right? We creating some written agendas so that the ideas that are there are ours, because we ain't trying to have nobody else's ideas put upon us anymore. So The reality for Afro-descendants in the United States is that we're a special minority in a majority hostile state. We're indigenous and Afro-descendants. We're non-self-governing, right? And the only way a special minority can have any power in a minority state is through self-determination. So this concept of indigenous and Afro-descendants, as you can see in 2019, they were singing the 2019, 1619 Kumba song. That's a lie. That's a lie. It did not start for us in 1619. It started for us in 1492 when the Catholic Pope launched a papal bull and launched a war against us, people of color and indigenous people all across the globe. And it had the greatest impact on us as Black people in Africa, right? So this is the time of the Great Ma'afa. It started in 1492 with the papal bulls, and there was a couple papal bulls. And then we're not foolish. We see signs of our ancestors everywhere, right? So these are some of the pictures, Black Californian Indian, ancient West African king holding artifacts found at St. Augustine culture, right? Stone carving of a shaman. So we know, and we have proof, and we have experts from the human rights. Look at the Olmec gigantic stone up at the top there. You're a highly advanced civilization to begin to create all these things because you got the time to do it, right? And so what are indigenous people? The most important thing is that we originate on occurring naturally in a particular place. We know for sure we came before Columbus and these people, and Columbus never got to the United States. So let's make that clear, right? And as indigenous people, we have a superior right to authority over the land and to ourselves. And this is covered under the ICCPR, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And this allows us to identify. So sometimes you'll hear, and when Sister Elena speaks, you'll hear her speak about this, right? This is a big claim. We are indigenous people. This sister, Sophia Giza, wrote a book on it. I would recommend that book, Mound Builders in Ancient America, A Legacy Reclaimed. And I want you to tell people, right? There was no transatlantic slave trade. Instead, it was a transatlantic war against African descendants, right? So we was never slaves. We were enslaved people. And it's very important for you to name yourself accordingly. And you're also prisoners of war. And from the moment of capture, you're a prisoner of war. And you still ain't free. So who are the Afro-descendants? The Afro-descendant is a term that came up in the 2000. And it says, as a person of African origin who lives in the Americas and in the region of the African diaspora as a result of slavery, who have been denied the exercise of their fundamental rights, okay? So Afro-descendants are colonized people in the United States, and they've been mislabeled Negro, colored, Black, Afro-American, and now African-American in attempts to hide their true identity as indigenous people and national minorities. National minorities are those who are here at the time of the foundation of a country. In this case, we're looking at their 1619 story, their 1776 story, and we was here, even though we were enslaved at that time, but we were national minorities. And we're currently living under belligerent occupation by these European colonizers, right? So in the case of the Afro-descendant, the foreign power subjugated into colonial rule, right? Some of them stole our ancestors from Africa, brought them here, and then some of them were already here, but because they had made Black, the color of our skin, a sign of enslavement, then they caught up all the free people and made them into slaves, right? Or they enslaved them. And so we are suffering under the doctrine of unequal exchange. So let's look at power, right? This lack of diversity, you see it in the political leadership, where Blacks are in the House. We are 10.5%, so that's increased recently, but the House gets elected every 2 years. That's not where the real power is. The real power is in the Senate when it's there for 6 years and jack us up, right? So we're 36% of the population, non-whites, and 10% of the Senate, 21.6% of the House. And when you look at, in all of our time, you see that even who they call Latinos, look at those guys up there, Bob Menendez, Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz. These are not, Latino means you speak Spanish, but these are white men because they are descendants of the colonizers, right? So conveniently labeled Latino, right? They're white. So when you look at the Congress and the Senate, you can see that the numbers they're overwhelmingly the majority. And so in 155 years, we've only had 11 African descendants serve in the US Senate. Yet we are allegedly free since 1865, right? So it's a lie, it's a farce. And most of the people who are senators is really in the last few years, last maybe 50 years. So there's been a growth in the non-white representation in the Congress, but whites still have disproportionate representation. So African descendants must be politically able to focus on our own development, and this right to development is a collective right. So clearly we do not have enough political power in the current system to improve our well-being. That's why we keep fighting and fighting and fighting and fighting. I am tired of fighting like that, right? Self-determination is a much better outcome for us. So we have Black representatives who do not represent the Black community. And Glenn Ford of the Black Agenda wrote, when 80% of Black Democrats in the House vote for continued militarization of local police forces, and then 4 years later, 75% of these same Black Democrats give protected class status to cops, then we must conclude the intervening period of Black Lives Matter agitation had no effect on Black Democratic policies. And further, that the caucus is wholly and brazenly unaccountable to its constituents. They need to have courage. So what we're seeing is colonization, because these people may be Black in color, but they do not represent our interests based on all the data that I have shown you. We are in the decade of the International Decade of People of African Descent, which started in 2015, and the theme is recognition, justice, and development. And I say to you, isn't it time for the African Americans to get justice and have a plan for development? And we call it self-determination. So what is self-determination? The right to, the principle allows the people to choose its own political status and to determine its own form of economic, cultural, and social development. And this can result in a variety of different outcomes, ranging from political independence through to full integration within a state. The Native Americans in some way have some self-determination because some of the land is there, and on those tribal lands, they have their own government and they have their own police, etc., right? But that is an incomplete self-determination. That would be a subject for another day. So this right to self-determination is covered by Article 1 in the Civil and Political Rights, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And the state parties that sign and ratify this have a responsibility for the administration of non-self-governing and trust territories, right? And shall promote the right and realization of self-determination. The United States has not done that for us. And part of that problem is that in 1960, when they had the Decolonization Act, the Decolonization Act said all the countries of the world who had colonized people should have noted, said that this is who they are and put them on the list. Instead, the United States never did that. Yet you were clearly living under apartheid. And in many ways, you're still living under apartheid based on all the things that we've seen so far, right? So let's talk about the power of perception. There are people who doubt that 47 million Afro-descendant people should not be self-determined. So let's look at the Europeans. This is why I love data. I mean, I get really excited about this stuff here. Look at this. Europeans are 7% of the world's landmass, Europe, 10% of the world's population, and yet they got 50 countries out of 193 countries in the world. So they are 10% of the landmass, no, 7% of the landmass, 10% of the population, and have over 25% of the power at the UN, right? So what is clear to me is that 40 of these 50 countries have less people than we have in our 47 million African Americans here just in the United States. So clearly the white people understand self-determination. The question is, why is that not okay for us? We have written the UN. We sent them our Declaration of Self-Determination when we filed this in 2018. And we sent it in October to the Decolonization Committee, and we got an acknowledgement of receipt and nothing else. We want to know why we have not been added to the decolonization list. And so in 2016, the UN Working Group of Experts came to Chicago. They came to the United States for a country visit, and came to Chicago, went to like 7 cities across the country, and people came from all over. Our hearing here in Chicago was supposed to be in this room. We had to go out into the full floor of this building done at Chicago State, right? And they pointed to the continuing link between present injustice and the dark chapters of American history. And they also said the US owed its Black population reparations. And they delivered this to the General Assembly in September 2016. Now, in 2016, we were under Barack Obama, people, okay? You notice we haven't had any reparations yet, right? But he gave reparations to everybody else. So we began to understand, after hearing the testimony, the African Americans in different parts of the country, the working group is concerned about the implementation of civil rights laws not being sufficiently effective. This is where human rights comes in, right? To overcome and transform the structural racial discrimination against African Americans. And what it noted was that many of the international laws that the US had actually signed, but they failed to ratify. And if you don't ratify the law, then it's not applicable to you on a local level, right? So they're slick. They come in, they help shape, but then they bring it back. The good old boy network does not allow it to be ratified. So the working group talked about that, the core international treaties, that the US, the working group urges the government to consider ratification of the core international treaties. And so when we look at the ask as we move forward, that needs to be an ask to the Biden administration. They must ratify the core international treaties because these remove any gaps in protection and full enjoyment of the rights for African descendant people here. And then Mitch McConnell at the time was bold enough to say he opposed reparation because none of us currently living are responsible for slavery. But we show you from the data that they certainly are reaping the benefits of their past, right? While we're reaping the benefits of our past too. And then current policy also discriminates against us and put us in the condition that we are. So I like to say that the reparations issue is not just an issue of slavery, it's also an issue of Jim Crow, which hasn't ended till today. And then he said, we tried to deal with our original sin of slavery by fighting a civil war, by passing landmark civil rights legislation. We elected an African-American president. And I say to him, whoopee-doo, right? Because the first Black president never pursued policies bold enough to close the racial wealth gap, nor address the issue of reparations. Until today, when you hear Obama speak, he still ain't comfortable with it. And that's probably because Obama doesn't really understand our enslaved experience, being that his family was not. So in 2017, special rapporteurs, that just means a special reporter from the UN came in and highlighted the undermining of democracy, imposition of artificial or unnecessary IDs, blatant manipulation of polls, the relocation of the DMV, the general ramping up of obstacles to vote. You see what's going on in Georgia right now, right? And then we observed all of those things that they had highlighted in 2017 that clearly nobody paid attention to, right? When the past president tried to steal the election. And then we see it now with what's going on with the Georgia, where they have put in place laws to disenfranchise us once again. Like they're really bold. Why? Because like Milton Friedman said, shock doctrine, they prepared for the crisis. This was a crisis for them because they lost the state. And so they immediately had laws that they were putting into place. You see, that's what happens when you organize. So we just want to see that General Assembly Resolution 60/147, which is the basic principles and guidelines on the right to a remedy and reparations for victims of gross violations of international law, be implemented. The forms of reparation include restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, satisfaction, and guarantees of non-repetition. This is what we want. This is what we're entitled to, right? And so the key elements of the right to development, people-centered development, human rights-based approach, participation, equity, right? Non-discrimination and self-determination. We want those. We have a right to develop. And then why self-determination is important to us. It's going to give us power over the real estate and territories, right? Our signatures on the consent form do this. We must consent to our own power. That's democracy. Isn't that what they claim we are? We can have our own school districts. We can have our own board of education. We can hire our own educators. When we integrated the education system, a lot of Black teachers lost jobs. This will bring millions of dollars back to our community. It will build the Black middle class. We'll create school-centered communities and employ our community to provide services. This will increase jobs and decrease crime. The crime is high because there's been no economic development in our community. This will help our children by having nurturing teachers. Parents will be given the wraparound services that I see in all these other communities, white and Latino. I need to see those wraparound services in our community. We will now be able to prepare future adults to meet the needs of our community in STEAM, science, technology, entrepreneurship, engineering, arts, and I'm going to add another A, agriculture and math, right? We can prepare future doctors, engineers, nurses, lawyers. Anything we need, we should be able to develop out of our community. When we did some data in Chicago on Roseland and some other communities on the South Side, one thing that was stark to me, that when you looked at the people who were outside of the community who had jobs there, it was a large number. So here are jobs within our community and other people are coming in to get them, right? Because our children have not been prepared academically. Self-determination is our only remedy. We must make all the decisions on our children and not leave it to historical enemies to do this. So we formed a confederation. It's a political strategy that changes configuration from a national minority to a majority in our areas. What does that mean? It means that you take out your red pen in the areas where we are majority. That's our area, right? So now we are majority in that area. Montevideo Convention says 4 steps to building a nation. We must have a people. We got that. We must have land. Take out your red pen and circle up where we live, majority, and form a government, right? And recognition by another country. So on October 1st, 2017, we were in Tougaloo, Mississippi, and we had people represented from around the world. And we signed a declaration, African Descendant Nation Confederation, and we signed a declaration of self-determination. Our declaration includes the Afro-descendants across the Caribbean, South America, right? And in April 2018, we filed this with the UN. In October, we filed a request for the Decolonization Committee. In 2018, we gave notice to the Secretary of State for the US, the UN Secretariat, Organizations of American States, and the African Union. We were recognized by Venezuela in September 2019, and the next step is to form an interim government. So we have met 3 of the steps, and now we need to form an interim government. This is a wealth transfer. Self-determination is a legal strategy. It gives us possession of the land. Sister Elena will talk more about that and all of its institution, right? So politics is who gets what to build your economic base. As you can see, the other groups are building their base, right? And they do that through political representation. We have not been politically represented. So we need to be able to come together, 47 million people, and be a voting bloc and negotiate with presidential candidates and local power bases for power, right? Too often we give our vote for no reason. So self-determination is a wealth transfer strategy. As you can see, we're in desperate need of this transfer. It will bring billions to the community. Chicago's budget is 11.65 billion, and we are 30% of the population now, and our fair share will be 3.5 billion. Self-determination allows us to possess the land as we are indigenous people, and courts have already told you individual organizations cannot have the capacity to represent us. So the African Descendant Nation Confederation is how we can do this legally. We're proposing a special peace jurisdiction, form a special peace tribunal, and then we have tribunal judges. So we have lawyers who are working on that right now to negotiate transfer of power over the institution with the hostile authorities in our areas. That's your schools, your police, your health. Can you imagine? Your schools are hostile, yes. The police, the health, the welfare, garbage, everything that is in our community should be transferred to our community. And then there's a transitionary period where we deal with the hostile authority and we resolve issues, and then we map out steps, transfer of institutions, buildings, education, etc., federal funding to the new interim government. And this will affect our economics, our education, our health and welfare, infrastructure, police. And then with the incarcerated, we have such a large number of people incarcerated, we will now have an opportunity to rehabilitate these people, right? Special rehab programs, which you have to complete to be freed. And then rehab, a lot of people in jail on drugs, and they get job training, counseling, etc., and help them to reintegrate into our community. So we need your consent form to transfer power, become one tribe, South and West Side. Again, this is the example for Chicago. And people need the consent to do that, right? Everything we do is democratic. So we call this a democratization process, right? The consent form would have 3 ballot questions. You'd agree to join the African Descendant Nation, also known as the Afro-Descendant Nation. That's what we are known internationally also as, and draft a ballot to withdraw from city council, consent to establish our own tribal council. You're still dual citizens in your own country, folks. So for those who worry about their, things that they already have, you're going to still have them. You're just like the Native American, right? You'd be the same. So in 2021, we asked people to support the African Descendant Nation's right to self-determination, as stated in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, that was ratified by your Senate, okay? That therefore it is law. And then we talked about the democratization project right? Consent to our power, formation of special peace jurisdiction, and compact with the US for free association. That's the agreement we're looking for now with the United States. We want to be added to the decolonization list. And then we're going to be notifying the new administration of the actions that we've taken and request a meeting, right? We want to be able to negotiate a free association agreement, which means that we would still be citizens of the United States, but we would have those areas just like the Native Americans, who we are also, and be able to begin to transfer power and control of our own lives. If you are a victim of domestic abuse, do you stay in the house and get beaten every day, or do you separate? And we think it's time for us to separate. In 1865, Sherman asked the ministers in Atlanta, what would you like us to do? And the ministers said, based on our history with you, we think we should separate. But instead, they forcefully integrated us. So we are trying to address these issues now. So free association will give you dual citizenship, negotiable issues with the United States of America. As you see on the left, national security, criminal justice matters, economic relations, reparations, communication, foreign affairs, diplomatic relations, immigration, environmental protection, interstate transportation, and money, right? And we would have establish our local government, raise our own taxes, establish and maintain schools, regulate trade. And this is where, when you saw the National Black Agenda, where we talked about international affairs, because as Black people, we're 47 million, and we are descendants of the people in the continent and from the Caribbean and South America. So we want to establish trade. We'll be able to establish trade with over 1 billion people. That's 1 billion people, right? We're like 1.5 billion altogether. So that's a big trade that we could be doing, right? Conduct elections, establish a central bank, borrow money, provide for public safety, and provide for public welfare. So it would be a shared sovereignty. The UN would come in and help us to improve and establish the infrastructure, and the Pendle Center, which we are a part of, for human rights and self-determination, along with all those who have been working with us along this way, and new people who will come in, will help to facilitate the process. We only facilitating the process, right? All of us collectively own this. So this is what it would look like. Money comes right now through the federal government, goes to state government, comes to us. We call ourselves the Confederation, but we're part of all of this, right? And when we become confederated and have a free association agreement, the money will come from the federal government directly to the Confederation. And we're not trying to have it like the Bureau of Indian Affairs, because that's been another farce and cover up and fraud. So even though some parts of what we're looking at relate to that, we're trying to create a system that's going to work for us, not another con artist job by these people, right? So recognition of sovereignty, grand state and the sovereignty, a character of international legitimacy, and consequently a capacity to enter into relations with other sovereign states. That's what we're looking for. And the Confederation will seek a compact of free association with the United States, so it will be self-governed. And this is what the little chart looks like. The declaratory nation was in October 1st, 2017. We now need to move to forming interim government, so the world will take us seriously, right? Then we can hold a plebiscite vote as all across the nation, the 47 million of 18 and over, whatever our requirements are, vote to say, yes, this is what we want to do. And then we form a constitutionally democratic free association agreement with the United States. So based on the things that we have talked about, this is the step that we're taking, right? As my work as a human rights defender. And I know some of the information and the data can be overwhelming. So to let you know that we're also about solutions. So we've created education solutions, right? That meets the need of the community. ESL for Black students and free tutoring to catch up, core curriculum, investment in the trades, right? These are just some of the things. Culturally relevant education. Some of the reason why the children are doing so well is because they go in there and they tired of hearing about everybody else, right? And they want to know why their ancestors are depicted in such a demeaning way and or not depicted at all. So we want to improve the primary, secondary, and tertiary, increase teachers' pay, free college for all Afro-descendants. That would be a very fair reparations, and forgiveness of all student loans, because that has prevented many in the Black community who didn't have their parents' home and other things to borrow from or be given or left inheritance to rise up, right? Forgiveness of the student loans. And then health solutions, Sister Ya likes to talk about health equity, and the Robert Johnson Foundation says health equity means that everyone has a fair and just opportunity to be as healthy as possible. And this requires removing obstacles to health, such as poverty, discrimination, and their consequences, including powerlessness, lack of access to good jobs with fair pay, quality education, housing, safe environment, and healthcare. So folks, everything is always wrapped together, right? And so we talk about solutions, address the root cause of the poor health, the food deserts. This include working with the Black farmers, inserting agriculture in the curriculum, the discriminatory practices towards the Black farmers by the USDA and the banks, increased funding for healthy solutions and farmers markets, etc. This is stuff that we in community have people already doing, and we just need to increase it. And then free healthcare for all, right? Enforce the Affordable Care Act, more health clinics in our community, and more health clinics that deal with alternate healthcare, right? Alternate forms of distributing health. Reduction in the C-sections, which is really a form of birth control, and different access to medications based on insurance. And when we look at schools, we have to have more scholarship to create more healthcare workers. We see opportunity. Though the data is depressing, just flip it. So we have a lack of this. That means that we now can begin to focus our children to create what we need. That's opportunity, right? And when we own our community, then they're going to get the opportunity. So invest in education to make sure all students can achieve, and curriculum to include health, exercise, and the arts to reduce that high obesity, to improve the ability to choose the right food, right? And then give scholarships to nurses and doctors and the whole holistic field so we can get people out there. And then when it comes to police accountability, I'm going to just flip through these slides. Enforce the consent decree. The state has already sued the city of Chicago and came up with a whole consent decree. We just keep saying, enforce the consent decree. You can go onto their website and look it up, right? Community policing and impartial policing. Use of force needs to be addressed. Accountability and transparency. Recruitment, hiring, and promotion. If you look in our communities, you see so many people who don't look like us. And when they come, they're so afraid of us because of their own stereotype and prejudice. So when they come, they're a walking time bomb. They need to leave and go to their own community. And we need to develop our own, right? And we don't need all this police. They're now spending, I think, $100 million on a new police training center. Really? That could be spent in our community on economic development. So enforce the consent decree and stop spending all this money on the police. 40% of the budget is spent on the police. That is stupidity. And everywhere across the country that I've been, and I look at the data, I see the same stupidity. 25 to 40% of the budget on the police. And crime ain't going down because that money should have been spent on the citizens. So crisis intervention, data management, implementation. The data management, making sure that when they are doing things to us, they're capturing it by race because we know that they're discriminating against us. So recently in January, and actually in February, he signed it. Governor Pritchett signed a controversial justice reform bill. And so the police officers have to now wear a body camera, attend police training, no chokeholds. I mean, imagine we have to tell them this, right? Don't kill us, right? Maintenance of police misconduct records. And then it used to be like 5 years. Now it's going to stay there so you can see the pattern of behavior, because it's not that all the police are bad. But the ones that are, they have allowed them to get away with murder, right? And then special prosecutors and police involved deaths. The police union and others worked heavily against this. Again, who do they represent? We're paying them to do what, right? So this was a very good beginning here in Chicago, and that was we can thank the Black Caucus, who really led this push since last August, and that was a positive sign. So what we're basically saying is, with the help of having a Black agenda, with the help of the experts in our community, who you've seen some of them and others, they have empowered the legislators to do the right thing. And that's how we see the work we do here with the Big Mama movement, by empowering others through right knowledge to then do the right thing. So power conceives nothing without a demand. It never did and it never will. That's what Frederick Douglass said. And I ask you, what role will you play in your own liberation, right? Our liberation, your liberation, Black power. So thank you very much. That's the end of my presentation.